all. Okay. Thank you for that introduction, Andy. Hi, everybody. Hi. Okay. Thank you, Randy, for that introduction again, and for the staff and faculty at Fulbright who have organized this opportunity for me to share some of my research. I want to just add that I am here longer than a few weeks. I'll be here for actually until the end of December, so I have a bit more work that I plan to do, but I think this is a great opportunity for me to share what I've done to date and help have an interesting dialogue and discussion today, hopefully, on some of the things that I have found with you all. So I wanted to come up with a catchy name for my research project. So I came up with this acronym, Strengthening Adolescents' Lives, which is SAL, which in Korean can mean life. And as Randy said, the purpose of my research has been to explore the mental health and school achievement of adolescents who are growing up in orphanages and in adoptive families in South Korea currently. So first, though, I wanted to introduce some terminology that that's related to child welfare. So currently the term for orphanage in Korean is koawan. But I was told by most of the directors of the orphanages that that term is kind of not used anymore because it has a lot of negative connotations to it. And so the preference now is to call them child welfare facilities, 아동복지시설. So I will refer to them as facilities and not as orphanages throughout my presentation. Also, I use kind of this unwieldy term called children in need of protection or children without parental care, rather than orphan, to refer to those children who, for whatever reasons, are not living with their biological parents. And I use this term rather than orphan because our orphan has conjures up a lot of images like Orphan Annie and that sort of thing. And the fact is that all children, even for true orphans in which their biological parents both have died, have a family. Every child comes into a family. So the issue is really the need of those children who have families, who maybe for whatever reason, like I said before, cannot take care of them, the protections that they need then, that adults can give. So first I wanted to introduce a little bit about why this topic is particularly of interest to me. It's both personal and professional. I was adopted from Korea when I was 3.5. And what I know of my early history was that I lived with my birth family, for my birth parents for a little while. And then I lived in an orphanage for about 6 months, and then I was adopted overseas. And so that picture on the left, actually, is me and the children at my orphanage, which was on an island off of Incheon. And I'm the one on the far left front row. And then on the right is my transformation into my life as Hollee McGinnis. And that's my mom and my brother and my sister, who are both biological, obviously, to my parents. So, for me growing up, I never really felt like I was an orphan because I had a mom and a dad. I had brothers and sisters. I had a family. But when my late adolescence is when I really began to think about and be interested in learning more about my experiences, mostly based on my race. When I went to college, I began to really explore my racial identity because I really wanted to understand how I, with an Asian face, an Irish last name, and a blonde hair mom could be an American. And that research that I did as an undergraduate ended up laying the foundation for the organization that I started called Also Known As. And the name of the organization is really intended to create a space for transcultural people to embrace their dual identities. In the case of adoptees, it's their dual identity by birth and adoption. I am known as Hollee McGinnis, but I'm also known as Ihwa Young, and that is my Korean birth name. And the organization created a mentorship program and other activities to help other families who had been formed through international adoption, particularly adult adoptees. And in 2000, the organization sponsored a motherland trip to Korea for adult adoptees. and Chris was there actually, as well as others. And that was the first time I actually got to go visit an orphanage in Korea. It was in Cheonju. It was a baby's home. So babies' homes, all the children are under the age of 5. And at that time, I had no training in social work or child development or anything like that. My major was American Studies, actually. And so I went in there, and all the little kids had their faces pressed up against the door. And as we interacted with the children, I noticed their behavior. Some of them would cling to me, other ones would just completely ignore me. And I was really struck by those behaviors. And also, it was eerily quiet. There wasn't a lot of chatter necessarily with the kids as well. And then at one point we had lunch, and so all the little kids had sat around this table on the ground, and then all of us adult adoptees went and sat around that same exact table as they did. And I was really struck with kind of this convergence of past and present. I realized that at one point in time, particularly for those adoptees in the 60s and the 70s, we had sat in those same places as those children were now sitting in that orphanage. And I really became curious about what happened to those kids. So with that, I decided to pursue my master's in social work and do research on adoption-related policy. But I always wanted to get back to those kids in the institutions and find out what happened to them. So most of my work prior to coming to Korea was focusing on kind of the international adoption slice of the pie. And as I began to do more research, I realized that international adoption. It has a lot of media attention and a lot of research is focused on it. But there was this whole other piece of Korea's child welfare system that very few people have written and published about. And so I became really curious and interested then to find out about what was happening with those children. And there's been a criticism around Korea saying that Koreans have not taken care of their children. And these figures just really surprised me because it really showed that Koreans have been taking care of their kids, predominantly in institutions, but they've also participated in domestic adoption as well, with about 85,000 kids being domestically adopted. And these numbers are all estimates because there is a lot of informal adoptions that have happened domestically as well, and those are not really accounted for. And so I think that I'm hoping that my presentation will kind of give you a fuller picture of the full pie. So in general then, why study adolescents in facilities and adoptive families? Well, beyond my personal interest, globally this is a huge problem. Between 2 and 8 million children are estimated to be living and growing up in some sort of a facility around the world. And the research on children in institutional care has been conducted for the last 100 years, mostly in Western nations. And the most rigorous studies actually have been coming out since the 1990s, focusing mostly on children who've been cared for in orphanages in Romania. And these studies are really well done, and again, really affirming kind of the negative effects of institutional care on children's emotional and behavioral and social development. And then research on adoption has also been conducted for a while, for about 60 years, again, mostly in Western countries. And these studies also have confirmed that when children move from abusive homes or from inconsistent foster care or institutions into adoption, they fare much better than those children who stay in institutions. But research also comparing kids who've been adopted to kids who are in healthy biological families have also found that adoptees as a group are at greater risk for mental health and emotional and school problems as well. So the context of South Korea is very interesting too, because despite Korea's huge economic development over the last 30 years, 40 years, it continues to disproportionately rely on institutions to care and protect for the children who are without parental care. So these are figures, the most complete figures that I could find, and these are in 2010. So about almost 16,000 children at that time were being cared for in institutions, about 1,400 through domestic adoption, 1,000 in international adoption, and separately from those in care, about 8,500 kids had been abandoned that year. So on the one hand, the good news is that Korea has a lot of different forms of alternative care, but not all forms have developed equally, with Korea over-relying on international adoption for most of the past 40 years. So there's going to be a real need going forward. There still are children in facilities, and there is a need to think about what is the best way to care for them. In addition, the research on children in the orphanages is very limited. I was really surprised when I began to look that most research has only been conducted since 2000, but institutions and orphanages in Korea have been around since the turn of the 19th century. The first orphanages were established by missionaries. And also research on domestic adoption have been almost completely non-existent because of the practice of closed adoption, where children are not even told that they are adopted, so it's basically secret. So since the late 1990s, there has been more a movement toward open adoption, which is disclosed adoptions, and so some research now is beginning to emerge on that group of people. So the bit of research that I was able to find that's been conducted over the last 15 years has some limitations to them. Few of them have focused on adolescents, and few of them have looked at school outcomes, and also they've looked at a kind of a limited set of risk factors. And so I was very interested in, particularly in the context of Korea, all cultures kind of maintain the importance of blood in defining family, but it's particularly acute in Korean culture. So I was interested in how being a non-biological family through adoption or living in an orphanage might also be a contributing factor to children's mental health in school. So that's a piece that my research is adding that has not been looked at before. And kind of why I'm focusing on adolescents as well. This is some research that I had done prior, and this was a US sample. And it was a national sample of adult adoptees. And so the Korean line, the blue line, those are Korean adult adoptees raised in two-parent white families, transracial adoptions. And the white line, the red line, are white adoptees who are in same-race adoption placements. And we asked this question, when in their development did adoption identity become important to them? And I think what was really telling and compelling is that while it was important to some preschoolers and people in preschool and elementary school, by middle school, clearly half of both samples said their adoption identity was important to them. And that increased all the way up through young adulthood. So by middle school, half of the samples in both samples said this was important, and by young adulthood, over 70 and 80% said so. So it really indicated to me that this is a critical time in which people are thinking about the meaning of their adoption, and so it's critical then to see if this is paralleled in Korea. So my research questions are basically three. What are the problems and strengths of adolescents growing up in child welfare facilities and adoptive families in Korea? My second question is, are there differences in mental health and academic achievement between those two groups of kids, and what factors significantly contribute to their mental health and academic problems? And I've attacked these questions using a mixed method. Mostly for the first research question, I've conducted literature review, informant interviews, looking at archival information. I also have conducted focus groups with particular caregivers, orphanage caregivers, and adoptive parents, and some adult adoptees, domestic, and adults who formerly had lived in a facility. And then I also am conducting their structured interviews, 1-hour interviews with adolescents who are currently in the orphanages and who are currently adopted. So I'm hoping through all those methods I'll be able to get at these questions. Particularly the differences between the two will be mostly relying on the quantitative part of my study, and basically taking a sample of about 156, half adoptees and half kids in orphanages. My research is based on some theory. So basically I call them more frameworks than theories per se.
So Bronfenbrenner's bioecological theory of human development is a very broad framework about how people develop. And I like it because it really shows how individuals and families are embedded into systems, and these systems are nested into one another. I think it's also a really useful way to think about problems. So there could be problems resulting from the individual person's self, like genetic or one's character or personalities and stuff like that. Then there are risks and strengths within the microsystems. The microsystems are families and schools that immediately involve the child. And then the mesosystem is the interconnection between those microsystems, between the child's family and the child's school, for example. And then exosystems is kind of the extended family that doesn't necessarily involve the child on a daily basis, but that could be friends, neighbors, mass media, that sort of thing. And then the macrosystem is basically cultural attitudes and beliefs and practices. And then also what I like about Bronfenbrenner's model is that it includes time. So all of these things and changes are impacting people over time. And the risk and resilience framework basically uses the same model and looking at each of those levels to see which factors can potentially contribute to individual outcomes and which ones can be protective. Oh, the other thing that I like about it is that it kind of shows the different research perspectives that one might have depending on which level you're analyzing. So psychologists tend to look more at the individual and maybe the family, whereas depending on the kind of anthropology, I guess you do, and sociology looks at these more macro level processes. And then I'm testing that, this is my third framework, which is that I'm testing, which looks at, I'm adapting David Burdinsky's stress and coping model of adoption adjustment. And so this incorporates a lot of the ideas of different levels in looking at potential risk and protective factors, but what it adds is this idea of cognitions and coping. And so the model primarily says that loss, specifically of biological connections and origins, is the core experience of adoption, and that this loss can be a potential source of stress that can contribute to feelings of rejection and being different, emotions that might underlie some adoptee psychological adjustment. And so at the heart of the model then is that adoptees' adjustment may be mediated, so it might have direct effects in terms of these risk factors, such as their placement history and family environment, but the effects might also work through the individual's cognitions and thinkings, particularly about the loss of their birth family. So that's something, the cognitions around birth parent loss and macro system factors of perceived stigma are kind of the two variables that I'm adding to this model. And also, I'm extending it to see if this model would apply to children who are in the facilities. My hunch is that the children in facilities also experience not getting a chance to grow up with their biological family and loss, and so they also might struggle with some of the cognitions and coping with the loss of their birth family as well. So of course, I hope my study will make some contributions. First, I want to expand general knowledge around the emotional school needs of kids who are teens in the orphanages and adoptive families in Korea, and also increase some comparative research. Most of the research on these topics have been done on the West and not in Asian countries. I'm also interested in expanding general knowledge around adolescent experiences here in South Korea, and also looking at kind of a new novel pathway, which is this cognitive coping pathway that might explain for some of the emotional and behavior problems that kids might be having. Also, the piece related to out-of-home care stigma, I think, is very novel as well. And hopefully this information will relate to interventions and policies and future research. Okay, so this is what I'll talk about for the next 20 minutes. I thought it would be useful to kind of give an education around how children get into the child welfare system in Korea. And then I'll talk a little bit about some of the findings that I've had. These are preliminary. I was hoping that I would be able to present some of the quantitative data, but I've completed about 81 interviews, and I will be doing more, but I haven't had a chance to input it and do any statistics with it yet. So that will be accessed later. You can read my dissertation in a year. And then I'll focus specifically on these two variables that I'm interested in, which is struggling kind of with parent loss and stigma. And then I will talk briefly about some of the synthesis of the macro level factors that I've been thinking about a lot these days, and also further questions that I have about these issues. So these are statistics from the Ministry of Health and Welfare of some of the reasons why children entered into protective care between 2007 and 2011. So about of all the kids who entered in, the vast majority of them, the reason for entering into care was because of poverty, parental unemployment, child abuse, neglect, and other. And for those children who enter for those reasons, almost all of them will go into the facility. Other research has also confirmed that for children particularly over the age of 2, divorce, remarriage, economic hardships are kind of the main reasons why they enter in. And of the directors of the orphanages that I spoke to, they said that up to 80% of the kids who are now entering into their facilities have some experience with abuse and neglect. And part of the explanation for that, they said, was that when the parents are going through a separation or a divorce, they tend to neglect the child. And then also over the last 5 years or so, the Korean government has increased efforts to report cases of child abuse and neglect. So it might not be that there's more child abuse and neglect happening, it's just being reported more than the past. But that was a significant difference that I had heard, especially from directors of facilities who have been around since the 1940s. They said that's a big change over the last 10 years. In the past year, the orphanages in Seoul that I visited, they also reported that they had an increase in the number of infants being abandoned at the facilities. And some of them said that it was related to the baby box and the publicity related to that. But they are just seeing an increase in kind of infants. The majority of the children who are in the facilities, as I said before, have parents, so they're not true orphans where the parents had actually died. And most of them cannot be adopted because the parents have not terminated their legal rights to the kids. And so some children from institutions are adopted. Some of the adopted parents that I've met who are open and disclose the adoption to their kids had adopted older kids, like at the age of 9 or 6 from institutions. But for the vast majority of the kids who enter into the facilities, they will stay there until they age out at 19. One of the adolescent girls who participated in my survey, she actually shared with my interviewer that she had a chance to be adopted. And so she was interviewed, she was 16, and she said she was about 11 when this opportunity happened. And when the director of the orphanage actually approached her biological parents who hadn't visited her at all at the facility, they denied it, so she couldn't be adopted. And so during the interview, she was still quite upset by the fact that her biological parents hadn't released her for adoption. What's interesting is that a law was passed in December that would automatically terminate parental rights if a parent doesn't have contact with the child in a facility for, I think, about 3 years, therefore opening the pathway to adoption. But the effectiveness of this law will be very interesting to see. Some of the facility caregivers that I spoke to really thought they weren't that supportive of adoption, and quite frankly didn't have very close relationships with adoption agencies. So some of the facility caregivers that I spoke to, they felt that the children experienced more stability in their care. And there are cases where domestic adoptions do disrupt, and when that happens, the children will enter into institutions as well. So the other huge reason why children enter into protection is because of the birth mother is single. And of those of the single moms who have children, 80% of them will end up in adoption, and that will be either domestically or overseas. And it is possible, though, that a child who has a birth mom who makes an adoption plan is not able to be placed with a family, and in that case, the adoption agency has 4 years to place that child in a family. And if they do not place that child into a family, then the child will go into the institutions. So I make these arrows because the majority of kids who come from single parents will go into adoption, and the majority of kids who enter in because of poverty will go into facilities, but there is some overlap. So what are some of the problems that I've heard that the adolescents in the facilities and adoptive families have experienced? Like I said, in the domestic adoption, most of the kids are adopted as infants, but there are some who have adopted older children from facilities. And those are the parents who reported to me that their children struggled with attention problems at school, diagnoses with ADHD, and that sort of thing. They also said that some of those kids struggled with their interpersonal relationships with others, and they attributed it largely to their time in the facility. Also, particularly by middle school, a lot of the adoptive parents also reported that their kids, and again, all the adoptive parents that I'm speaking to are ones who have disclosed their adoption. I wasn't going to talk to anybody and suddenly out them that they were adopted. But many of the adoptive parents said that the kids themselves, by middle school and definitely high school, began to say, "Mom, I really don't want you to tell people that I'm adopted because I don't want to be bullied." And I did speak to one adult adoptee. He was 20, and he did report that in middle school he was bullied. I'll talk a little bit more about that case a little later. In the facilities, one of the main problems the directors in the facilities that I spoke to had was this increasing number of kids coming in with histories of abuse and neglect. And there are mental health issues related to that and other experiences they had. One adolescent that I spoke to was actively suicidal, and we had to confirm that he was receiving services, and he was, for it. Also, the directors reported that a lot of their children have borderline IQs. So again, IQ can change. Some of it is genetic, some of it might be related to their neglect experiences in their birth families, but some of it can also be related to the quality of care in the facility. And I was told one story from a director of a facility for children with disabilities, said that they were given a child and they were said, "This child is mentally retarded, if they belong in your facility." And after about a year of intensive care, the child was developmentally on schedule and was able to go back to regular school. So they attributed it to kind of the quality of care that kid had received at the other institution. So one of the good news from looking at some of the preliminary surveys from the kids in the institutions was that generally not a lot of them have reported being bullied at all because they're in an institution, and some of the caregivers reported that the kids will invite school friends over to the institution. But there does seem to be a problem of bullying in the facility itself, between housemates and that sort of thing. And but the caregivers do seem to be aware of it, so that's good. But the greatest problem for the kids in the institutions is once they leave. Most of them by middle school, their future employment is already settled because the middle schools begin to track them into a vocational high school or an academic high school. If they end up going to a vocational high school, they will complete that and begin a job, ideally. And if they go to the academic high school and they actually get into a university, Many of them can go because tuition is covered by the government, but the government does not pay for living expenses. So a kid who's in Gume, for example, might get to go to Seoul Day, but because they can't afford the cost of living in Seoul, they'll end up going to a university in Gume instead because they can stay in the orphanage as well. So even though there are opportunities, there's also more barriers that prevent kids from fully being able to maximize their opportunities. Do adolescents struggle with issues of birth parent loss? So most of the adoptive parents that I met, they did not have any contact with their child's biological family. I did meet one who did look for their son's biological father and kind of said that she regretted it afterwards because her son wasn't really prepared, and I think the birth father wasn't very well prepared either. So that definitely is a place for future research to look at kind of the reunion needs in domestic adoption. And in my focus group with adoptive parents, all of them said, though, that their children had asked about their biological family, which to me isn't a big surprise. But what was interesting was how much the adoptive parents actually struggled with those discussions with their kids. And feeling like they were in competition with the biological family. One adoptive mom said that when her daughter had told her that she wanted to find her birth mother, she said, "What about me? I cannot live without you." And then another adoptive parent said that whenever she did something that her child didn't like, she would say, "You're not my real mom," and then she would say that she wants to find her birth mom. So even for the parents who have disclosed that their kid is adopted, like I said, by middle school, many times the adoptees themselves, who were very comfortable to share with other people that they were adopted, no longer wanted anybody to know that they were adopted. For the kids in the facilities, some do have contact with their biological family, and some of them visit very regularly, some of them once a year, some of them was only once ever. So there's a huge range in terms of the level of contact that the children do have with their birth family. But there is a group of kids who really have no information and they don't know. And one of the kids that I had interviewed, he entered the facility when he was 3 and never knew why he was there. And so with some reluctance, he did share that he tried to get information by breaking into the director's office and looking at his file, which I gave him a lot of kudos for trying to find out something. And definitely in his scales in terms of birth parent loss, he had a lot more questions and a lot more anger toward his biological family than those who had more regular contact with them. But what was also interesting was how often the caregivers downplayed the importance of the birth family. And again, most of them said to me, well, most of them see them. So they're kind of looking at it too broadly and not looking at each individual child's case and questions. And also, one caregiver shared with me that at school they had a class assignment about their family, and they're always told to write about the director of the orphanage because that's their legal guardian. And so one kid decided to actually write about his birth father, and that apparently caused all these problems because it was inconsistent with the information the school had and that sort of thing. So again, the children in the facilities struggle, I think, with who their family actually is in ways that parallel adoptees' experiences. So do adolescents experience stigma because of their current living situation? So stigma was really hard for me to get out at my focus group conversations. If I asked you directly, especially the adoptive parents all said no, they didn't experience any, their children didn't experience any direct prejudice because of being adopted. But when I asked more roundabout questions, I would say that the majority of my focus group participants, when I asked them, oh, when did you tell your family that you were going to adopt? Almost all of them said that they didn't do it until after the child came in to the home. And then almost all of them also reported that at least one family member strongly opposed the adoption, even after the child had arrived. Most of them by this time reporting that the kids are accepted, but they did struggle in the early part of the placement. And then one adult adoptee, that I mentioned earlier that I interviewed, he said that in middle school he was teased a lot. And he said it started off because he had small eyes and he had a small stature, but then for some reason he decided to tell him that he was adopted as well. So of course that added to the intensity. And he said though by high school he got into a different group of friends who accepted him for who he was and his adoption, and it wasn't as much of a problem. But middle school does seem to be a time where at least fear of being the kid picked on is quite high. For the children in the facilities, the directors reported that some of the youth were often scapegoated for problems that happened in school. So they would get a lot of calls, there'd be a lot of kids involved in some incident, and it was kind of the kids who were in the institutions that were kind of singled out. But again, the greatest discrimination that the kids seem to experience is once they leave the facilities. For many of them, it's difficult for them to find a job, again, because they only go to a technical high school. And again, I think depending on what kind of high school, their chances of getting a job might be better or not. And then in some cases, they might have to talk about their birth family. And again, they can, I was told that if they know their birth family's name, they can produce a hojak. But if they don't, then they can only produce an orphan hojak, and then that again might deter them from getting a job because they are an orphan and not a full family. And also some have said that it's hard for them to marry people, and that they, particularly the men, they end up marrying, it's very hard for them to marry someone, especially of a higher social class than them. So some macro level factors that have come up repeatedly that I think are really interesting to talk about is one that, I came to Korea thinking I was going to study adoptive families and kids in orphanages, but what I realized is that my research is really a lot about the Korean family itself, and particularly the traditional notions of the Korean biological blood family. And because non-relative adoption directly contradicts these traditional notions of the blood family, it was very interesting to see how adoptive parents in particular negotiated their difference because of adoption. And in some ways made adoption fit the biological blood model, even in the cases where adoption was known to everybody. The first part is that adoption is still quite a secret here. I came in thinking that things had changed a whole lot because of kind of the activism that had been going on. But I had a conversation with a director of an orphanage, of an adoption agency, and she had a biological daughter and adopted her other daughter. And I said to her, "Oh, does your daughter know that she's adopted?" And she burst out into tears and said, "No, and I hope she never will have to." And I was very shocked because I also know that this agency has supports open adoption. But her attitude was that that open and telling and disclosing the adoption is a decision for the parent, and it's not something that has to happen. And I think research in adoption in the U.S. can be very informative, because most of the early research that happened in the 60s and the 70s were on white babies adopted into white families. So race is not an issue, it was purely adoption. And that's the research that really has showed some of these issues arising in terms of mental health, to such a point that some psychologists considered an adoption syndrome, which is not in favor anymore. So I think that there is still this need in Korean culture to keep things a secret, and that's the best way to protect an adopted person. And I think that there is more debate that needs to happen about whether that's really true or not. And then also in the gender preferences in adoption was also quite telling about how they negotiated kind of traditional notions of family. At first I thought the preference for girls was because girls' behavior are easier to manage, and that was some things that adoptive parents told me. But then as I dug a little bit deeper, people gave me other explanations as well. And the most interesting one was that when people said, well, traditionally in Korea, girls were adopted out of the family. And so all of the traditional obligations of Chesa and honor your ancestors, girls were never involved in any way. And so by adopting a girl, you avoid all of the complexities that would happen if you adopted a non-blood boy and did not have a biological son. Could that son actually do all of the family rights? And what was interesting is that boys were adopted. I saw boys there. But many of the boys came into families in which the parents were almost second-time parents. They already had biological children. They typically already had a biological son. And so they had the space to have another boy because all of the social obligations were already fulfilled because they already had the biological son. Conversely, in the facilities, and I have to look more at the data to see if this is statistically significant, but I saw a lot of boys in the institutions. And again, I don't know if potentially, and this would be something to explore, if more boys are being abandoned and left at the institutions. And also, I think the fact that family divorce, abuse and neglect, multicultural families, some of the caregivers said they don't know if the children are multiracial because they look Asian, but they suspect that some of the children that are left there as well. Really reflect changing families in Korea in general as well. And also the big problem that there's few supports really for families to stay together and then to reunify children once they are disrupted out. So currently, if a child enters into the facility because of child abuse or neglect, the director of the agency has no way of protecting the child, so the birth family can come into the institution and take the child out without having to prove that they in any way have changed their behavior in terms of caregiving. And so a lot of the caregivers said the kids would bounce back and forth from their biological family to the institutions because the birth family is actually not getting any help to change their behavior. And then another problem is that there are more mental health problems that the kids are showing, but the resources for that is pretty minimal. Although I was impressed with two of the institutions that I visited in Seoul. They were either had a community mental health services on the premise, or they were building it. So much has been changing. This has been a very exciting year to be in Korea for child welfare. Because a lot of things at the macro level has been shifting. So what I'm writing about now will be historical pretty soon, I think. But one of the big changes is that there's a big shift right now to dismantle the large child welfare rearing facilities. Most of the orphanages or institutions that I visited had a capacity of about 100 kids, but there are mega institutions that can house about up to 700. And so they've been moving the children slowly into more group facilities or into these 100-bed facilities as well that I have visited, but there's still a long way to go. Foster care had traditionally been focused mostly for international kids who were slated for international adoption, but over the last decade, foster care has increased a lot, but it still hasn't taken a lot of the children from the institutions either. And furthermore, because of the increasing, at least cases of child abuse and neglect, some of the children are going to have emotional problems and will not be able to really live in a family setting. So this really means that there still will be a need for institutions, and that the child welfare system might begin to look a little bit more like the US system, in which children might enter residential facilities to get their mental health needs met. And the other big gap, I guess, is that, like I said, there's almost no services at all. Maybe more in Seoul in large cities, but particularly the smaller cities that I visited, there's very little services to help families rehabilitate. So if there is problems with child abuse and neglect, there's really nowhere for the parents to go to have that fixed. And there's not a lot of legal mandates either to force the parent to get any services, which happens in the US. In adoption, the new adoption law, it's not so new anymore, was passed in 2012, and that's changed practice in terms of involving the family courts to finalize adoptions. And one of the adoption workers I spoke to really welcomed the changes, because she said now the court judges can make the final decision on the adoption, but another worker said that one judge denied a domestic adoption though because the prospective adoptive mom was vegetarian. So there's clearly still some need to help the courts make that final jurisdiction on who's a fit parent and who might not be. Again, this is just an anecdotal case, so, okay. And again, there is a big debate now too around the fact of whether this law caused more mothers to choose to abandon their child or not. Whatever the causal relationship, that will take a long time, but there are more infants being abandoned, and so that's another huge issue for institutions and agencies and everyone to think about. And then South Korea is in the process of ratifying the Hague Convention on International Adoption, and so again that will bring into a lot of changes, and I think some of the changes that are already happening is to make Korea more aligned with that convention, but the full impact of that we'll have to wait and see. And also, over the last 15 years, there's been a huge introduction of NGOs and activists in the world of child welfare. These are domestic adoptive parents and single and wed mom groups and adult overseas adoptees, which Andrea has been doing a lot of research on. And so the landscape has a whole new groups of players kind of impacting how adoption and child welfare practices in general are being shaped. And I think the debate's really valuable because all of these groups have sincere interest in making the system better, but it also can tip to not working collaboratively with people, which would be a shame because I think if all of these groups got together, they can make huge impact on the lives of kids who are without families. So I'm trying to synthesize all of this information and this system that's going on. And so I wanted to, for a minute, make you do a little imagining, okay? So I want you to imagine a large river with a high waterfall. At the bottom of the waterfall, hundreds of people are working frantically, trying to save those who've fallen into the river and have fallen down the waterfall, many of them drowning. As the people along the shore are trying to rescue as many as possible, one individual looks up and sees a seemingly never-ending stream of people falling down the waterfall and begins to run upstream. One of the other rescuers hollers, "Where are you going? There's so many people that need help here." To which the man replies, or woman, "I'm going upstream to find out why so many people are falling into the river." So to me, this picture depicts the river, the waterfall, and the people who are trying to help the people who have fallen into the waterfall. At the top part, up here, this is where people are falling in. The child welfare system here is the waterfall. And down here is downstream, people trying to get people out of the waterfall. I think when we think about how to move forward on helping Korean kids who are without parental care, we need to look at it systematically and we must look at it holistically. For too long, we've focused only on specific interventions, maybe adoption, or single moms or poverty, but we need to look at it in its full impact because each is affecting the other. I think the two key areas that are very weak in the current system in Korea is family preservation and support. Up here, the upstream stuff. And then also following, so the Hague Convention has the principle of subsidiary, and basically what it says is that we recognize that for children's full development, family context is the best environment for a child's development. And if that can't be, and ideally it should be done in country first and then out country options. So that's the idea of subsidiary. And this continuum of care goes from adoption to facilities. And I highlight kind of in the light green, those are all families. And institutions are like groups and facilities. And so the second area that is very weak is kind of moving children from group home and facilities back into their families. If we have interventions here, children could safely return back and be back in families again. If there's more support for single moms, then children can stay in families and never go downstream. If there's more support and laws that affect divorce, that mandate financial support to children, other sorts of things, then children might not be as economically and emotionally threatened by a divorce as well. So we must look at the whole picture and affect both upstream and downstream and supports. So the good news is that I think South Korea has the capacity to do this. There's a professional social work, they have this continuum of care in place, but Korea spends one of the lowest than any other OECD country on social welfare. So that's a big problem. So there really is a huge lack of resources to meet the full protection for children. And so, as it is, there's a lack of adequate resources, but still, we need to help people both in the short term and the long term. And so we need to continue to look and collaborate on this full picture. And then some other challenges that I think we need to think about is, I think adolescents in the facilities and adoptive families is a fascinating prism to really look at South Korean society in the 21st century. While the traditional notions of blood family still remain really strong, Korea is going through a tremendous transformation of their families by divorce, remarriage, multicultural families, people delaying marriage and staying single. And how this is all going to flesh out will be very interesting. But I think adoptive families is part of this transformation of Korean families, and how Korea will shift and move as a society to accept these different families remains a big question in the future as well. And also, we must think about this child welfare system as being interconnected to other systems too, including family registration and labor laws and schools. These other systems perpetuate the stigma and discrimination that these children and their families are experiencing because they're not traditional. And if those contexts are not addressed as well as the resources to the child welfare system itself, things will not really change either. And then I think ultimately, this question of how to best allocate limited resources for the care of children in need of protection is one about ethics. And so this is something that needs to continue to be debated rigorously. I had one pediatrician who's done a lot of work with children in Romanian orphanages, and he showed me this MRI. This is a child with extreme neglect, and this is a normally developing 3-year-old child. And he said, every child has a right to a brain. So that's like one extreme, And the fact is that the situation of children in need of protection falls in a much more grayer area. But we need to debate the best way to help those children maximize their opportunities in life. And I hope my research will be a part of that. So thank you. Oh, 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you for your presentation. I really appreciate your metaphor of the waterfall. I think it's very appropriate. I know we talked about this before, but my first question, and maybe I don't know if you've fleshed this issue out at all, is I know that the children who are raised in orphanages or institutions, facilities, they, generally speaking, come from families, abusive situations, experience a lot of neglect. Whereas over 90% of domestically adopted children are born to unwed mothers or single mothers. And so they don't have the same, or similar backgrounds at all. So I was wondering how you're able to measure the actual well-being or the mental development of these children when they come from such distinctly different backgrounds.
Yeah.
And I have one more question too, sorry. Just your choice of the term children in need of protection, and I completely understand why you use that when you're talking about children who come from backgrounds of abuse. Experienced abuse, but I was wondering if you, does that also include children who were born to unwed mother families and single mother families and multicultural families as well? Because just from my perspective, it's not really, they don't need protection. They don't really need protection from their own mothers.
Right.
So I'm just wondering if you thought about that at all.
So your first question about am I comparing apples and oranges? And that's just something that I've talked about a lot and that sort of thing. So I do think that in terms of the major outcomes, in terms of mental health and school, the kids who are adopted are going to look much different than the kids in the institutions. But we don't know that for sure in the context of Korea. So that's why it's still valuable to measure that. And then what factors might be contributing to that also could look very different. And there have been studies that looked at kids in the institutions here in Korea and kids who have been adopted, but never comparing the two with like the same surveys and questions. And so I do think that what will be interesting is kind of my main variables around birth parent loss, because that's where they're more similar. Like even though they might be higher SES in the adoptive family versus in the institution, those issues around birth family might still be parallel. So that will be a useful comparison. And I think stigma too will be something that will be a useful comparison. So those two key variables, I think, some comparison can be done, but I do agree with you that overall my expectation would be that the kids in institutions are going to look totally different in terms of overall outcomes than the other ones. But I'm open to being surprised. And then the terminology, I don't even like the children in need of protection word because I agree with you. What are we protecting and against what and whom? So another friend of mine was interviewing adults formerly in institutions, and they called themselves homeless. And so it was more of a sense of no home. They felt like they had family because they knew they were there somewhere too. So I think figuring out the best terminology to describe this group of kids is really essential, and I haven't perfected that. So. If you think of one. Yes?
Again, thank you for your wonderful discussion. Thank you for reviewing and our current case. So I also have like two questions, all in a similar vein, but they're pretty speculative, so obviously if you don't really understand, just tell me. It's really speculative.
Okay.
So the first one is you mentioned the fact that a lot of girls are more so adopted than the boys are.
Mm-hmm.
And on that note, did you ever like do any research on like where their origins are from? Along that line, I mean, like, are they ethnically Korean or actually multicultural because of possible multicultural marriages that are occurring more so along the countryside, where there are like normally like Korean farmers that don't manage to get like Korean wives.
Right.
They actually are part of this like buying wife system that like Southeast Asia is really selling right now.
Yeah.
And along that same line, you mentioned the divorce rates. Are the reasons for divorce released? And if they are there any correlations on like how those divorce rates actually affect, like the reason of divorce and how they affect the children while they're going through this childbirth fall process?
Yeah. So in my survey that the adolescents are taking, I asked them what their ethnicity is. It was very hard to figure out how to say that in Korean because people were like, that's really weird because they've never had to think about that. So I do ask, and again, it'll be self-report, so the kid may or may not know, and there's no way of verifying it. And I haven't done any surveys yet with the adoptees. So it would be interesting to find out maybe from like if I do more adoptive parent focus groups, if any of them would report that. But like there would be some information because the adopted person has to have a consent by their biological parent. But again, what they write down and who has that information, I haven't looked at that. So, but I have been trying to get at it. And then your second question, I haven't really looked at the divorce literature here in Korea. So it would be very interesting, especially in that kind of downstream, upstream thing. To really begin to tease out some of these factors and stuff, because that's where the meat's going to be in terms of family preservation, right? If we kind of understand why and how divorces are happening and how that's impacting kids and how they trickle down in a much more nuanced, specific way, rather than, person wrote divorce, that's the reason why they came in. But really understanding the pathways, and that's where I think qualitative research can really help show us how this is happening, the mechanism, I think it would be really valuable, but I haven't looked at that literature.
So looking at this slide, I sort of see like three natural buckets. So you have the family level, right, and then you describe like the legal, like social context, and then the institutions. In terms of looking at like right now, what level do you think needs the most investment from the government?
I think, again, we have to look at it all. I think we need to really bolster the, I'm not used to this. This family reunification piece, I think, is huge. It's completely neglected. And so kids are moving back and forth to their families here, because that's what the institutions have reported to me. But there's no way to ensure that the kid can go back and stay back and not bounce back and forth, because we know that movement of kids is really detrimental for them. So I think that in terms of, there are resources, these things have been going on, and I mean, there could always be more services needed down here, and there absolutely has to be more work here. So these are the two weak links. So if you ask me what needs to be worked on are these two areas, because right now they have the least support. There are, family poverty efforts. Again, is it really getting at the core of what's contributing to them moving into facilities? I'm not sure. They might be missing the mark. And again, these are all buckets that are huge areas of individual independent research. But there needs to be collaboration between them. Because, and I think that's where they're kind of right now more silos rather than working across. And I think if there's more collaboration here and then moving children this way as well, there could be a real big shift, I think. Oh, yeah.
I loved your talk. Quick question, I don't know if you looked at this or not, but did you see or do you suspect that there's be any difference in like the outcomes and the systems depending on like if it's a big urban city like Seoul versus if you're in a more rural, smaller community where maybe people know what's going on and you want?
Yeah, I mean, even in a large city like Seoul, it is so huge, and one of the facilities I visited was almost near Kimpo, and it felt like I was outside, like in the countryside. So even within a major metropolitan city, like it can feel very different. My observation so far is that the institutions in more rural areas have far less resources available to them. So only the Seoul institutions had a library, two of them had libraries, and were developing community mental health and that sort of thing, because they had access to a lot of people who had money and that they could bring in. Whereas the smaller institutions, smaller cities, they don't have as many potential donors. So I think that that's one of the biggest differences. And then also, some of the institutions in Seoul, they were much more, the kids kind of reported being like pressured a lot to do really well in school and kind of that sort of mentality, where I didn't hear that quite as much from the kids who were in more rural areas. Yeah.
I have a bunch of questions, but we'll save for an offline conversation. Why did you make these particular groups, and especially the one with divorce, multicultural families? I don't really see how those are similar at all.
Yeah, I think so the boxes are not perfect. I'm working this out now. But I was like, okay, this is a mental map. What I was trying to get at was like the other forces that are kind of breaking up the traditional family, so divorce is one thing.
That's clear.
Right.
Right.
Right, literally breaking. But the multicultural families too, I mean, maybe they don't fall perfectly into the divorce thing, but it's also transforming kind of typical Korean family by being bicultural. So that's kind of, not there are higher rates of separation, I think, but again, I haven't done enough research on the multicultural family issue, but it is higher than normal.
And then the other thing is, most of the things that you described as characteristics of children who are raised in facilities isn't very different that I've observed living in Daejeon. most of the children, the young adults I have as students are also from poor families, or first in their families to go to university, and they can't afford to go away for college, for
Yeah.
example. And we have a technical college disassociated. So I don't think, have you looked at how much is just a function of location and class rather than actually being in care?
No, I haven't. So absolutely, some of the questions that I have around school actually are pulled from a national data set on adolescents, and in that national data set there is an oversampling of adolescents in lower SES. So on some of my variables, I will be able to actually compare it to national data in Korea. So I will be able to look at some of that through the quantitative part of the research.
Thank you.
Okay.